After 22 years training their technicians, the CTO said I was irrelevant and dismissed me. Have you ever been shown the door when you thought you were professionally invincible? Well, I've been, and to be honest, it isn't nice. I am Mike Felters, and for 22 years, I was the backbone of technical training at Sagan's Tech. I didn't just teach people how to operate our industrial chemical processing systems. I lived them, breathed them, knew every quirk and warning sign like they were family members. I started at Sagan's Tech straight out of the Navy, where I'd worked on reactor systems. The transition to industrial chemical processing felt natural. The precision, the attention to detail, the absolute necessity of getting things right. It all clicked. Within 5 years, I was lead trainer. Within 10, I was designing entire certification programs. The old-timers used to joke that I could hear a pump bearing going bad from 3 floors away. Maybe they were right. I'd developed an almost supernatural sense for these systems. The way pressure readings fluctuated before a seal failed. The subtle vibration changes that preceded catastrophic breakdowns. More importantly, I knew how to pass that knowledge on. My training wasn't just about procedures and protocols. It was about intuition, about understanding the why behind every step. I'd walk new hires through scenarios, make them feel the weight of responsibility that came with operating million-dollar equipment. A manual can tell you what to do, I'd always say, but experience teaches you when something's wrong. Those weren't just words. In my 2 decades of training, we'd had 0 serious incidents. 0. The technicians I trained didn't just follow procedures, they understood them, questioned them when something seemed off, trusted their instincts. That kind of training takes time, relationship, trust. It takes someone who's been there. Inciting incident. The meeting was scheduled for 2 p.m. on a Tuesday. I remember because I'd just finished a morning session with 3 new hires, walking them through emergency shutdown procedures. They were getting it, asking the right questions, showing that spark of understanding that told me they'd be safe out there. Mike, we need to talk. David Chen's voice carried that corporate tone I'd learned to recognize over the years. Cold, calculated, final. He'd been CTO for 18 months, brought in from some tech startup where everything moved fast and disruption was the holy grail. The conversation lasted exactly 12 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on his wall, trying to process what I was hearing. The industry's changing, Mike. We need to be more efficient, more scalable. These online training modules can reach more people faster, and frankly, they're more cost-effective. I tried to explain. Tried to tell him about the nuances, the things you can't learn from a screen. The way an experienced technician can hear trouble before alarms start screaming. The instincts that come from working alongside someone who's seen it all. That's all irrelevant now, he said, not even looking up from his laptop. The modules cover everything. They're standardized, consistent. We don't need the old way of doing things. Irrelevant. 22 years of service, of keeping people safe, of building the best training program in the industry. Irrelevant. Clean out your locker, Mike. HR will handle the details. Walking to my locker felt surreal. 22 years of accumulated knowledge, relationships, pride, reduced to a cardboard box and a security escort. The new hires I'd been training that morning watched with confused expressions as I packed up my things. I wanted to tell them something, give them some final piece of advice, but what do you say? Good luck with the online modules. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about David's confidence, his absolute certainty that technology could replace human experience. Part of me wondered if he was right. Maybe I was just an old dinosaur, clinging to outdated methods. But then I remembered the close calls. The time Jennifer Walsh noticed an unusual vibration in Reactor 3 and shut it down 30 minutes before a bearing failure that would have caused a massive spill. She'd learned to trust that instinct in my training sessions. Would an online module have taught her that? Or the incident with the pressure vessel in Building C? Tony Rodriguez had felt something was off about the readings, even though they were technically within normal parameters. His gut told him to investigate further. Turned out a sensor was giving false readings. The actual pressure was approaching dangerous levels. Tony's training had taught him to trust his instincts over the numbers when something didn't feel right. These weren't isolated incidents. They were the result of a training philosophy that emphasized understanding over memorization, intuition, over strict adherence to protocols. You can't download that from a computer. Over the next few weeks, I tried to put Sagan's tech behind me. I applied for positions at other companies, even considered consulting work. But something kept nagging at me. I found myself driving past the facility, wondering how the transition was going, whether the new online training was really as effective as David claimed. 3 weeks after my termination, I got a call from Lisa Torres, one of the senior technicians I'd trained 7 years ago. We'd stayed in touch over the years. She was one of those natural leaders who'd eventually become a shift supervisor. "Mike, can we meet? Somewhere private?" We met at Denny's on Highway 9, the kind of place where industrial workers grabbed coffee between shifts. Lisa looked tired, stressed in a way I'd never seen before. "It's not working, Mike. The online training. It's a disaster. These new hires, they're coming onto the floor without a clue. They can recite procedures, sure, but they don't understand them. Yesterday I had to stop a kid from bypassing a safety interlock because the computer simulation showed it was faster." Lisa's words confirmed my worst fears, but hearing them still hit like a punch to the gut. "It gets worse," she continued. "Management's pushing us to move faster, get people certified quicker. The online modules take 2 weeks versus your 6-week program. David's calling it efficiency gains." I stirred my coffee, trying to process the implications. "What about the supervisors? Are they saying anything?" "That's the problem. Half of them are scared to speak up. They don't want to end up like you. The other half are buying into David's narrative that the old ways were holding us back." But Lisa wasn't alone in her concerns. Over the next week, I heard from Tom Bradley, another supervisor I'd worked with for 15 years. Then Janet Kim, who ran the quality assurance program. All of them painted the same picture: shortcuts, corner cutting, and a growing sense that something bad was inevitable. "The worst part," Tom told me during a late-night phone call, "is that these new hires think they know everything because they scored well on the online tests. They don't have the humility that comes from understanding how dangerous this work really is." I suggested they document everything, create a paper trail, but I could hear the resignation in their voices. David Chen had made it clear that questioning the new system was questioning his leadership, and questioning his leadership was a quick way to join me in the unemployment line. The most disturbing conversation came from Angela Martinez, a 10-year veteran who'd always been one of my most dedicated students. She'd been assigned to help with the transition, essentially replacing me as the point person for new hire training. "Mike, I don't know what I'm doing. These online modules, they're missing everything. The practical knowledge, the troubleshooting skills, the safety instincts, none of it's there. And when I try to supplement with hands-on training, management says I'm going off script." Angela's frustration was palpable. She'd been put in an impossible position, responsible for training but stripped of the tools and authority to do it properly. "What should I do?" she asked. I wanted to tell her to fight, to push back, to make them understand, but I also knew the reality of corporate politics. Speaking up had cost me my job. I couldn't ask her to sacrifice her career for a principle. "Document everything," I said finally. "Every concern, every near miss, every time you feel like the training isn't adequate. If something happens, and God, I hope it doesn't, you'll want a record that you tried to raise these issues." The first incident happened 5 weeks after my termination. A minor chemical spill in Building B. Not dangerous, but the kind of thing that should never happen with properly trained personnel. The technician involved, someone named Kevin Walsh, had been on the job for 3 weeks. He'd completed the online training with flying colors according to his records. The spill happened because Kevin didn't understand the interaction between 2 common chemicals. It was covered in the online module technically, but buried in a section about advanced chemical compatibility. In my training program, it would have been day 1, hands-on material, the kind of thing you learn by doing, not by reading. I heard about it through Lisa, who called me that evening. "Mike, it's starting. Kevin's a good kid, but he just doesn't have the foundation. The online training covered chemical compatibility in theory, but he'd never actually worked with these materials before today. The incident report blamed human error, but I knew better. This was systems failure, a predictable result of cutting corners on training. 2 weeks later, another incident. This time, a pump failure that should have been caught during routine maintenance. The technician responsible, Jennifer Reeves, had missed the warning signs because she'd never been taught to recognize them. The online module had a section on pump maintenance, complete with videos and diagrams, but it couldn't replicate the experience of actually listening to a pump that's about to fail. I started keeping my own records. Every incident, every near miss, every sign that the new training system was failing. Part of me hoped I was wrong, that maybe these were just growing pains. But the evidence was mounting. The breaking point came during a conversation with Tom Bradley. He'd called me after another close call, this time involving a pressure vessel that had been overfilled because the operator didn't understand the relationship between temperature and pressure. "Mike, I've been doing this for 20 years. I've never seen anything like this. We're having incidents at a rate I've never experienced. Small ones, thankfully, but it's only a matter of time." Tom's voice cracked as he continued. I tried to talk to David about it, showed him the incident reports, explained my concerns. You know what he said? "These are acceptable losses as we transition to a more efficient system." Acceptable losses, Mike. Like we're talking about manufacturing defects, not people's lives. I felt a familiar anger building, the same anger I'd felt walking out of David's office 6 weeks ago. But this time, it wasn't about my career or my pride. This was about the technicians I'd trained, the ones still working under this broken system, and the communities that surrounded these facilities. That night, I made a decision. I might not work for Sagan's Tech anymore, but I still had responsibilities. To the people I'd trained, to the industry I'd served, and to the principle that some things are more important than quarterly earnings. I started reaching out to my network, former colleagues, industry contacts, regulatory officials. I had 2 decades of relationships built on trust and competence. It was time to use them. The first call was to Robert Chen, no relation to David, a former Sagan's Tech engineer who now worked for the state regulatory agency. Robert had been through my training program 12 years ago, and we'd stayed in touch. "Robert, I need to talk to you about something. Unofficially, at first. But I think Sagan's Tech is cutting corners on safety training and people are going to get hurt." The conversation lasted 2 hours. Robert was careful, he had to be, but I could tell he was taking my concerns seriously. By the end of the call, he'd agreed to randomly inspect Sagan's Tech's training records and incident reports. The second call was to Patricia Walsh, a journalist who covered industrial safety for the regional newspaper. I'd met Patricia during a previous investigation, where Sagan's Tech had actually been held up as an example of best practices. That irony wasn't lost on me. "Patricia, I have a story for you, but it's going to require some digging, and it might not have a happy ending." Each conversation was a risk. David Chen had made it clear that former employees who caused trouble could face legal action. But at this point, I was beyond caring about threats. The evidence was mounting, and the stakes were too high to worry about personal consequences. The third call was the most difficult. I reached out to Angela Martinez, asking her to document everything she could about the training program's shortcomings. I knew I was putting her in a difficult position, but I also knew that without inside information, any investigation would be limited. "Mike, I'm scared," she admitted. "If they find out I'm talking to you..." "Angela, I understand. But if something serious happens and the way things are going, it's when, not if, you're going to be the one they blame. The only protection you have is documentation that shows you tried to raise these concerns." By the end of that week, I had a dossier of information that painted a clear picture of a training program in crisis. Incident reports, interview notes, technical analyses. Everything pointed to the same conclusion. Sagan's Tech's rush to implement online training was creating dangerous gaps in safety knowledge. But I also knew that documentation wasn't enough. Regulatory agencies move slowly, journalists need compelling stories, and corporate lawyers are very good at making problems disappear. What I needed was something undeniable, a smoking gun that would force everyone to pay attention. I didn't want that smoking gun to be a catastrophic accident. But as I reviewed the mounting evidence, I realized that might be exactly what it would take to expose the truth about Sagan's Tech's training failures. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Angela Martinez had been keeping detailed records, just as I'd asked, but she'd also been doing something else, trying to fix the training program from within. Despite management's directive to stick to the online modules, she'd been supplementing with hands-on instruction whenever possible. "Mike, I think I figured out what's really going on," she said during a clandestine meeting at a coffee shop 20 miles from the facility. "It's not just about cost savings. David's got a bigger plan." Angela explained that she'd been invited to a management meeting where David had outlined his vision for the future. The online training wasn't just about efficiency. It was the first step in a complete overhaul of operations. The goal was to create a workforce that could be easily replaced, standardized, and scaled across multiple facilities. He's planning to expand Sagan's Tech to 5 new locations over the next 2 years, Angela continued.
He thinks he can just copy-paste the online training program and have fully operational facilities in months instead of years. The implications hit me like a freight train. This wasn't just about cutting costs at our facility. It was about
creating a business model that treated skilled technicians as interchangeable parts. David's vision of the future had no place for expertise, intuition, or the kind of deep knowledge that takes years to develop. But Angela's revelation also gave me something I'd been missing, a clear motive and a timeline. If David was planning expansion, he'd need to show investors that the online training system was working. Any incidents or safety concerns would threaten that narrative. "Angela, I need you to find out more about this expansion plan. Timelines, locations, investment details, anything you can get your hands on." 2 days later, Angela called with more information. David had been in discussions with venture capital firms about funding the expansion. The online training system was a key selling point, proof that Sagan's Tech had solved the scalability problem that plagued traditional industrial operations. There was just one problem with David's timeline: the safety record. Even with the recent incidents kept quiet, any serious investigation would reveal the training program's shortcomings. David needed to show concrete success, and he needed to show it soon. That's when I understood the true scope of what was happening. This wasn't just corporate negligence, it was a calculated gamble with people's lives. David was betting that he could maintain the appearance of safety long enough to secure funding and prove his concept. I spent the next week connecting dots, following money trails, and building a comprehensive picture of David's plan. What I found was even worse than I'd imagined. The venture capital firm wasn't just funding expansion, they were buying into a vision of disrupting industrial safety training across the entire sector. If David succeeded, the model would spread. Others companies would adopt similar approaches, cutting corners on training to maximize profits and scalability. The expertise that had been built up over decades would be discarded in favor of standardized, lowest common denominator approaches. But I also realized something else. David's plan had a critical vulnerability. It depended entirely on maintaining the illusion of safety and effectiveness. A single major incident would expose the training program's failures and destroy the entire narrative. I didn't want that incident to happen. But I also knew that if I could predict when and where it was most likely to occur, I might be able to prevent it, or at least minimize the damage. Using my knowledge of the facility and the types of errors I'd been tracking, I started modeling potential failure scenarios. The most likely candidates were the new technicians who'd gone through only the online training, working on the most complex systems during high-stress periods. Building C's pressure vessels came up repeatedly in my calculations. They required precise monitoring and quick decision-making, exactly the kind of skills that couldn't be learned from a computer screen. And according to Angela, Building C was being staffed increasingly with new hires to meet production demands. I shared my analysis with Robert Chen at the regulatory agency, carefully framing it as a predictive model rather than inside information. If I were to guess where problems might emerge, I told him, I'd look closely at Building C, especially during the overnight shifts when supervision is lightest. Robert understood the implications. Mike, if you're right about this, we need to act fast. But I can't just walk in there based on a hunch. I need probable cause. That's when I realized what I had to do. I needed to create a situation that would force regulatory attention without waiting for a catastrophic accident. I needed to find a way to expose the training program's failures in a controlled, documented way. The answer came from an unexpected source: the online training modules themselves. Angela had been able to access the full curriculum, and what she found was startling. The modules were riddled with gaps, oversimplifications, and in some cases outright errors. Most damning was the section on emergency procedures. Critical safety steps had been condensed into bullet points. Complex decision trees had been simplified into flowcharts. And worst of all, several procedures had been modified to match the online format rather than real-world requirements. Mike, look at this, Angela said, showing me printouts from the emergency shutdown module. They've eliminated the step about checking secondary systems before restarting. In the online version, it just says follow standard restart procedures. But there are no standard restart procedures after an emergency shutdown. Every situation is different. This was exactly what I needed. Concrete evidence that the online training was not just inadequate but actively dangerous. I had documentation that could be independently verified, expert testimony about the real-world implications, and a clear narrative about corporate priorities overriding safety concerns. But I also knew that exposing this information would have consequences. David Chen was not someone who accepted criticism gracefully, and Sagan's Tech had resources to fight back legally and financially. Still, as I looked at the evidence spread across my kitchen table, incident reports, training module printouts, witness statements, regulatory correspondence, I knew I had to act. The question wasn't whether I should speak up, but how to do it in a way that would actually create change rather than just generating headlines. The plan came together over a weekend of careful coordination with Robert Chen and Patricia Walsh. We needed to create a situation where the training program's failures would be exposed simultaneously through regulatory action and media attention, making it impossible for Sagan's Tech to suppress or spin the story. Robert would conduct a surprise inspection focused on training records and emergency preparedness. Patricia would publish her investigation into the correlation between online training implementation and incident rates. And I would provide expert testimony that could tie everything together. The timing was critical. David Chen was scheduled to present his expansion plans to investors the following week. If we could expose the training program's failures before that presentation, we could prevent the model from spreading beyond Sagan's Tech. Monday morning, Robert arrived at Sagan's Tech with a team of inspectors. They had the authority to review all training records, interview personnel, and conduct spot checks on safety procedures. More importantly, they could shut down operations if they found immediate dangers. I waited at home, knowing that my phone would ring when the inspection uncovered what I knew was there. Angela had positioned herself to document the inspection process, while Tom Bradley and Lisa Torres were prepared to provide first-hand accounts of the training program's shortcomings. The call came at 11:47 a.m. Mike, we've got a problem. Robert's voice was tight with concern. The inspection is finding everything you predicted, but there's something else. Building C has been operating with a skeleton crew all morning. 3 technicians total, 2 of them brand new. And there's been a small leak in the primary cooling system that they've been trying to fix for 4 hours. My blood ran cold. This was exactly the scenario I'd been afraid of. New technicians dealing with a complex problem without adequate training or supervision. Robert, you need to shut that building down now. If they're trying to patch a cooling system leak without understanding the thermal dynamics, I'm on it. But Mike, I need you here. If this goes bad, I need someone who understands these systems to help coordinate the response. 15 minutes later, I was driving toward Sagan's Tech for the first time since my termination. The irony wasn't lost on me. The company that had declared me irrelevant was now facing a crisis that required exactly the kind of expertise they'd discarded. I arrived to find organized chaos. Robert's inspection team had effectively shut down Building C, ordering all non-essential personnel to evacuate while they assessed the cooling system problem. David Chen was nowhere to be seen. According to Angela, he'd been in emergency meetings with legal counsel since the inspection began. "Mike, thank God you're here." Tom Bradley met me at the entrance, his relief evident. "The leak's getting worse, and the new guys are in over their heads. We need someone who really understands this system." I followed Tom into Building C, where I found a scene that validated every concern I'd raised about the online training program. Two technicians who looked barely out of college were staring at a control panel like it was written in hieroglyphics, while pressure readings climbed steadily toward dangerous levels. "What's the status?" I asked, slipping back into my training role as naturally as putting on an old jacket. "We've got a leak in the primary cooling line," one of the technicians explained. "The online module said to isolate the section and reroute through the backup system, but the backup system isn't responding the way it's supposed to." I looked at the readings and immediately saw the problem. The backup system was working fine. It just wasn't designed to handle the full load immediately. You had to bring it online gradually, allowing pressure to equalize across multiple zones. This was exactly the kind of nuanced understanding that took months to develop and couldn't be taught through a computer screen. "Okay, here's what we're going to do," I said, moving to the control panel. "First, we're going to reduce the load on the backup system by throttling down production in sectors 4 and 7. Then we're going to gradually increase backup system pressure while monitoring thermal readings across the entire loop." For the next 2 hours, I worked alongside the technicians, walking them through each step of the process while explaining the reasoning behind every decision. It was impromptu training session, the kind of hands-on, real-world education that the online modules could never provide. By 3 p.m., we had the cooling system stabilized and the leak contained. Crisis averted, but the damage to Sagan's Tech's reputation was just beginning. Robert's inspection had uncovered systematic failures in the training program, inadequate documentation, undertrained personnel, and multiple safety violations that had been masked by luck rather than competence. Patricia Walsh had been documenting the entire incident, creating a real-time case study of how corporate cost-cutting could lead to dangerous situations. The final blow came when David Chen finally emerged from his legal meetings to find that his expansion presentation had been indefinitely postponed. The investors had gotten word of the inspection and incident, and they wanted answers before they'd consider funding any new facilities. "Mike." David's voice carried none of its earlier arrogance. "We need to talk." I looked at him across the facility that I'd served for over 2 decades, thinking about the technicians I'd trained, the accidents I'd prevented, and the expertise I'd built up over years of dedicated service. "No, David," I said finally. "We really don't." 6 months later, Sagan's Tech had completely overhauled its training program. The online modules were still part of the curriculum, but they were supplemented with extensive hands-on instruction, mentorship programs, and regular competency assessments. More importantly, the company had acknowledged that some forms of knowledge couldn't be digitized or standardized. David Chen had quietly resigned, citing strategic differences with the board of directors. His replacement, Catherine Brooks, was a 20-year industry veteran who understood the balance between innovation and safety. One of her first decisions was to offer me a consulting contract to help redesign the training program. I accepted, but on my terms. The new program would emphasize understanding over memorization, experience over credentials, and safety over efficiency. Most importantly, it would recognize that industrial expertise is built through relationships, mentorship, and the kind of deep knowledge that takes years to develop. Angela Martinez was promoted to Director of Training, a newly created position that gave her the authority to ensure proper instruction, regardless of corporate pressure. Tom Bradley and Lisa Torres became senior mentors, responsible for pairing experienced technicians with new hires for extended apprenticeships. The regulatory investigation resulted in industry-wide changes to training standards, making it much harder for companies to substitute online modules for comprehensive safety education. Patricia Walsh's reporting on the incident won several journalism awards and became a case study in business schools, about the dangers of prioritizing efficiency over expertise. But perhaps the most satisfying outcome was a letter I received from Kevin Walsh, the technician involved in that first chemical spill. He'd gone through the redesigned training program and was now working as a shift supervisor. "Mike," he wrote, "I wanted to thank you for fighting for proper training. I realize now how much I didn't know when I started here, and how dangerous that was. The new program taught me not just what to do, but how to think about these systems. I understand now why experience matters." Looking back, I realized that my termination wasn't really about cost savings or efficiency. It was about a fundamental misunderstanding of how expertise works, how safety is maintained, and what it means to be truly prepared for complex, high-stakes work.